So good evening to everybody. Can everyone have their headsets on, please, so that you can hear us? So we come to this panel, which is a very interesting panel on the clusters, and it's basically the science, technology, and innovation and driving the tech clusters, looking at the collaboration between India and the UK. We've had some very interesting collaborations with the UK on science, technology, and innovation, trying to see how we could get the various startup ecosystems moving ahead, connecting the academic research groups, connecting the industry, connecting various other groups together. I think through this conversation, which we've just agreed would be limited to about 45 minutes, so we close at 5 p.m. We'll just try and discuss and maybe get some um, ideas from the panelists as to how we could look at this. We know how important it is to have industry, academia coming together with the startups and the industry. And this whole concept of clusters is actually coming from there. The UK has wonderful experience on this. India is now getting into this through the new ecosystem that we've been trying to create. And the Department of Biotechnology, from where I am, has made a lot of effort in this direction to try and see how we take this forward. The academic innovation, which we know is important, it's important for us to bring it out of the academia and take it into the translational ecosystem. How does that happen? Where are the bottlenecks? How do we facilitate that? How do we connect it to the industry? So I think these are key questions which our panelists collectively would respond. Before we do a round of introduction, I would just like to say that this panel is been put together very well with a wonderful representation. And of course, I come and represent the government of India, but we do have the key players who are into the innovation ecosystem as being part of important incubation centers and accelerators, people from the academia. We have the startups, and then we have the investors, all critical components of this ecosystem as it moves on. I think key questions which this panel would respond to, as I said, more importantly than saying how do we take it forward, is what really are those gaps. We all know what the structure should be. We all know what clusters really mean to mean. Where are those gaps? Where are those challenges? Why do we have this problem that we suddenly say we have so much of research, we don't see it translated? Within India, we have this, we don't see enough spin-offs really coming out from our academic centers. Where is that bottleneck? Can we learn from the experience? Has UK done it better than us? Can we look at global experiences to see how we take it forward and see how we can then move this into a seamless flow of from the idea to the commercialization, which we all would love to see, bringing in all the innovators together. So with this, what I would do is request the panelists, starting from my right, to introduce themselves briefly. And after that, this is going to be a free-flowing conversation panel. Uh, Key issues that we have just spoken about, maybe each one will take a couple of minutes to address it from their perspective, and then we'll have a wrap up in terms of what we really are seeing as a conclusion. I'm not sure what the format allows question and answers. I don't think it does. I don't see mics with them. But if there is time, may not be having time with 45 minutes with that, but we can leave it at that. So maybe to begin with you.
Thank you so much. So my name is Priya Guha. I'm the Ecosystem General Manager for Rocket Space. We are a San Francisco headquartered business. We're an innovation platform business, but we opened up our doors to 1,000-person campus space in London just over a year ago. And in that space, we house funded technology businesses, so companies with seed funding and beyond across every vertical of technology. Just before I hand the mic over to Matt, I suppose the other hat in which I'm qualified to talk today is that I am also on the Council for Innovate UK. Innovate UK is the arm's length government body in the UK that supports the commercialisation process for the best of innovation research that comes out of UK institutions and helps companies commercialise that research and overcome some of the gaps in terms of the risk-reward journey for commercialisation of research.
Thanks, Priya. My name's Matt Biagietti and I'm from Invest Liverpool, and my role is to support the health and life sciences cluster in Liverpool City region. So I work a lot with the local companies in Liverpool I work with the universities, the hospitals and healthcare centres, and we're trying to create a really thriving ecosystem here in Liverpool around health and life sciences. We also work to attract companies from abroad, so we have a very strong international agenda as well. And in Liverpool, we have a number of clusters, small, innovative clusters of companies in Knowledge Quarter, Liverpool, in the city centre. We have a large science and innovation campus just on the edge of Liverpool called SciTech Daresbury, which focuses very much on AI and big data, and it has a cluster of companies. We have the Baltic Triangle, which is a cluster of technology companies, particularly video gaming, which is very thriving also in the city centre. And then to the southeast of the city, area called Speak and Runcorn, we have a cluster of biomanufacturing companies. So some of the global biomanufacturing names, the likes of AstraZeneca, Seqirus, Allergan, Eli Lilly, are all located very close to each other in the southeast of the city. And my role is to go around those companies, helping them, supporting them, doing what I can to help them grow and connect with organisations around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Good evening. My name is Srinath Srinivasa. I'm the Dean of Research and Development at IIIT Bangalore. So IIIT stands for International Institute of Information Technology. These were schools that started after the IT revolution in the 1990s. By design, our school is kind of organized in what we call a public-private partnership model. So we like to believe that we are much more open to the industry and much more because we are dependent on raising our own funds for running our operations. And we are located in the heart of it's called India's Silicon Valley in Electronic City in India, and we have several partnerships with UK academics and including government, UK government in different forms, including research projects. We also run think tanks for both the government of Karnataka and the government of India. For example, on the National Data and Analytics portal that the Niti Aayog is coming up, that's one of the things we advise them on that. And there's also a big data portal for governance coming up in the government of Karnataka. That's also we are advising on that. We are also hosting one of Karnataka's biggest initiatives on machine learning for social change. It's called the MINRO Center, Machine Learning and Robotics Center. And so that's a brief about it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Srinivas Kolipara. I'm the founder of a company called T-Hub in Hyderabad. It's a not-for-profit entity that works very, very closely with our state government with a dual mandate. One, to turn our city into one of the top startup cities in the world, and the second, to help startups to scale globally. We do that through a couple of different things. We have the largest incubator in the country with about 140 startups. We run the largest corporate innovation division that runs programs for companies like Boeing, Facebook, HSBC, Intel, etc. And we do international market access programs for international startups to come into India and scale, but also for Indian startups to go global. Apart from this, we're also working with several state governments, advising them on building out their ecosystems, and a bunch of other ecosystem stuff. So.
Hello, I represent IIT Delhi. You must have all heard about it. It's a comprehensive technology transfer organization, more of an industrial interface. So as the name suggests, it's Foundation for Innovation and Technology Transfer, and we do all that actually has been said. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Clark. I'm the Director of Trade and Investment for the Sheffield City region in the UK. We, as an organisation, are tasked with economic growth, and my team's particular role is around opportunities for companies to export more overseas and inward investment coming in, as well as joint ventures and collaborations in all sorts of different areas.
Thank you very much. And as I promised, we'll begin with Rachel so that we can give her the opportunity to give her comments before she leaves. But I think it's also important, it's not only because of that, because you represent one of the key end users of this entire value chain. You're looking at trying to help companies to be able to become globally important in this whole trade and commerce area. Looking at that, looking at startups, looking at the way they are coming up now, where do you feel that this whole cluster approach is important? Because when you look at startups who come in with wonderful businesses, and especially if you're looking at tech startups, there has to be a lot of technology which comes in from academia, from industry, and those connections need to happen. How would you perceive it, and where do you feel that these sort of clusters need to really work on to be able to build such startups who can then fuel that whole ecosystem that you're working towards?
That's quite a long question. Um, I guess to give you a bit of a history on the Sheffield City region, we, going back in time a while, we were the first region in the UK to set up the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre, which is now one of the UK's catapult centres. And if you've been on any of the other sessions today, you may have heard that term, you might have heard MTC talking. And what's been really important for us around the Catapult Centre is bringing together, as has been described, academia, industry, underpinned with government funding. And what that has meant is that obviously research and development is brought to market way sooner than normally happens. But because of the type of model the Catapult Centres operate on, so for those that are not familiar with them, they are a membership organisation that is run by a faculty of engineering within the University of Sheffield. Any company from all around the world can be a member, and they can both commission research or take part as part of their membership in the research that's developed. So that started particularly around machining within aerospace and has developed into lots of other different things. But what's been really important about that is that it started to create a whole ecosystem of bringing together both large players in the original equipment manufacturers, tier ones, right through to your startup companies and university spin-outs and tech companies that are involved within the manufacturing space. So, you know, we've both got similar challenges within India and the UK in certain areas. And so within the industrial strategy, and particularly within the digital manufacturing arena, if you don't move forward, you don't stand still, you move backwards. And so it's really important for us that we build an ecosystem that allows the tech companies to really be part of what's going on within that whole space. So that is developed out into what we're calling the Global Innovation Corridor. The latest companies to move into that space have been Boeing and McLaren, that have both set up new manufacturing facilities that have opened with this year. So it's been an incredible journey that's taken quite a period of time, but I think answers the question that you asked me.
Thank you for this, Rachel. And maybe Priya, will move to you because you have been supporting through your company a large number of startups. And where do you feel that the need for clusters is currently there? And do you actually feel that clusters would help these startups to be able to move forward in their journey?
I mean, the answer is very simply yes. Otherwise, I'm not sure we should be having this panel in the first place. But if you look at what companies get from being part of an ecosystem, you know, what are the elements that make an ecosystem? You need to have people. You need to have talented, bright individuals who have the ideas to start a business. You then need talent to feed that business, both in terms of entry-level sort of developer talent, but also serial entrepreneur talent that you can sometimes get from the movement of people between countries as well. Immigration's a key part of that. Then if you look at, well, you need the academic base, the academic research that often spins out the ideas that we're just talking about, and we've got some great examples of that here from the Indian side in particular. You then also need to have market access. You know, you need to be able to have companies to sell to partner with. That's really crucial, and I think, you know, each of these clusters as they develop need to remember that the market access is a key part of the startup journey. And last but very much not least, investment. And I think, you know, what is sometimes challenging, if you look at the journey of getting investment for a startup, it is genuinely, and I'm sure, you know, Srinivas, you've seen this in T-Hub as well, it's the one thing that the founder's always thinking about because it will be the defining moment for them being able to scale their business. And I think we have an increasing amount of early stage funding coming through, But actually what we need to be able to do is get all of our companies in front of the larger funding opportunities that will allow them to scale to sort of series C, D, E, really, really scale their businesses. And that's a fantastic opportunity that I think the collaboration across borders that we're talking about in the context of the India-UK tech partnership can really bring. Because the last but not least part of that equation is actually government. Governments are a really key part of facilitating the sorts of opportunities that help that ecosystem flourish, whether that's local government in the form of Sheffield or what they're doing in Liverpool that Matt's described, or actually national governments. And I think what we're seeing is the tech partnership giving both a framework to facilitate that growth, but also, and very importantly, understanding where actually governments can stifle the growth of business and actually where regulation is perhaps not a good thing to allow the development of the technology.
Thank you. That was a very important point that you made at the end, that the governments need to see what role they actually play in this entire growth. So it's always important, and the government that I represent, we've been very clear from our department that the role that we need to play is that of a facilitator and an enabler and a catalyst to take it forward, being very careful how deep you need to get into the system. For two reasons. One is, of course, it's certain systems move much better when they're allowed to move the way they are with just that facilitation. And many a times, it's also not a good idea for the government to go too deep into it, because it's all the more difficult to pull out of it then. And there is a sort of a dependency that the ecosystem starts having on the government. So it's important to see how far the government needs to go. So maybe Matthew, now that you are looking at the clusters and you've got a very close observation as to where they are, some of the points which Priya said as to how they would love to see clusters growing, I think you've really experienced it in the cluster that you've been handling. So if you can share your experiences on that.
Yeah, there's 3 or 4 clusters in Liverpool that I can think about in health and life sciences, and the environment's very important. It's building the right environment for companies to thrive, and that's partly about buildings, bricks and mortar, having really interesting and exciting buildings that companies want to be in. It's also about the sense of place in a community. It's not always clustering in the same location, but in terms of a neighbourhood like the Knowledge Quarter, I think the quality of place, a place that you want to get out there, walk around, meet up in, I think is really important. You can have buildings which are quite sterile and they have office space and not much else, and you can have buildings which have cafes and meeting places and shared workspaces. I think those are the environments where you can come into work, meet a company across the desk, share some ideas, and maybe even get more companies growing from that. I think also identity is important. It's getting a sense of identity for a cluster. When I look at places around the world that I think might be good investment locations for Liverpool, I look at how they're presented and marketed and the identity for them, and likewise I see other areas which don't have the same amount of investment into the identity of the place, and you don't get a sense of what it's about, and that's more difficult for an investment agency or a company to look at and build relationships. And then it's the linking up of them all as well. That's really important. So when you look at talking to a cluster, I go and meet companies a lot in an area. They might not always know that there's a company down the road which is doing something very, very complementary to what that company is doing. So we try and think of ways that we can encourage communication between the companies, and that's kind of building a society and a community for the companies. So social events, I think, can't be underestimated either.
Yes, I think the point that you mentioned about the role that the clusters play in providing the connections, I think that's a very important and critical component of it. And probably all those who are here, and when we've looked at startup journey, I think that's a very critical component in the growth of any startup, because many a times that's really where the bottleneck is. They don't know where to make the connections, and even if they don't have the right connections. And I think that is a very important role which the clusters can play. And it's not just the connections in terms of connecting with the peers or connecting with similar companies, but I think across the entire development chain, looking at, of course, connecting with similar groups, but when we are talking about technology transfers, looking at the academic research that would moving forward in terms of the mentorship, because a lot of them would be, and especially the area that I represent, the life sciences and biotechnology, it's a high risk area. They would have wonderful science, but they really wouldn't know how to create a business out of it. And I think that mentorship, and probably that's really where the clusters can help. So that's a wonderful point about making connections. Srinath, you represent the academia, and we are now looking towards the academia to see more and more startups and entrepreneurs actually coming from this academia. What really are the challenges which you are facing in your institute and within the academia? Why are we not seeing more students, researchers, engineers actually moving out to create companies within India?
Yeah, very important question, something which I have very strong views about. The reality today is that despite major changes that have happened in the economy, in the industry and so on, academia still continues to create job seekers rather than job creators. And I think there are some deep structural changes that are still required. For a long time, our academia has been based on formal examination assessment models. And the entire the entire concern of students has kind of reduced to a single point on how to fare in exams and so on. There's a complete ecosystem around how to top in exams. There are even TV channels called on toppers and so on. And, so it's completely a formal exam kind of system that has been built, which the implicit message that we are sending is that do not experiment, do not fail, failure is bad, and so on. Which is kind of inimical to any startup environment that we need to create. And recently there have been some changes that have come about, the push into what's called outcomes-based education. But what has happened is that when the message that's going back into the academia is that outcomes is translated to exam scores again. So it's just becoming the same thing once more, and the entire system is just getting back into the same mold. So maybe I would like to even make one concrete proposal, a concept called ventures-based education, where the government or including the industry and so on act as some kind of venture capitalists into the students. So provide them some problems right in the second year of their work and so on, which they can work on for the next 3 years and come out with a realistic solution. And it doesn't matter if they fail, even if they show some results, if they're mentored through the process, right? And that gets them to take risks and learn some really good, important skills like critical thinking or problem solving and so on, right? And so currently what's happening is that a lot of innovation and creativity is reduced to things like hackathons and so on. The message again that's going there is innovation is driven by intense, small period activity, right? And like half an hour or 1 day or so on. And that's not the way innovation works. Innovation builds over a long period of time. It's evolutionary in nature, and there are a lot of dead ends that we need to first go through before we get real good results. And that message is somehow not going to the students. So I think there are some structural changes that are required.
Thank you, Srinath, but I'll come back to you with another point, and probably this is the right time to ask you that as well. You say that, of course, the universities or the academia, we do not teach our children, our students, how to fail. I think that's a very important point, and probably that really has to be built into our curriculum or the way we look at it. But it's also important to see that how do we actually encourage the researchers and other students to look at that research or a PhD that they do is not very, it's not that if they've got into a PhD career they cannot take up becoming a startup or an entrepreneur. I think somewhere it's important for us to convey that message that these are not two parallel tracks which are never going to meet. And I think that really is the wrong message. And I say this out of experience because in the Department of Biotechnology, we have this company called BIRAC, which is supporting a lot of innovations. We started this experiment and we set up university innovation clusters, where we said exactly this, that we will fund research fellows, innovation research fellows, which could be a PhD program of theirs, but which is actually going to help them to become entrepreneurs and take that on an entrepreneurial journey. What we've seen in the last couple of years is whoever we have funded, those have been again routine PhD projects which have come from their supervisors rather than being programs which they want to take up. So now we are trying to revisit that to see where did we go wrong, how can we bring in that culture. So I think you have to let us know that can a researcher or an academic group which is working in your institute, do you have a way to facilitate them to take their own research forward rather than saying you have to choose something different if you have to become an entrepreneur?
Very pertinent question. So just to give my own story, I've graduated 6 PhD students so far, and none of them are in the academia now. They're all in the industry. And 2 of them have actually started their own company. It's called DataWeave. It's apparently doing very well. They've moved to the US and doing lots of big data analytics for media companies and so on. So one of the things that we have done in our institute, just to give, speaking from experience, is to institute a system of industry collaboration where we kind of set up a joint partnership with somebody in the industry who can understand exploratory research, partner with them, make them a co-supervisor while the primary supervisor of the research is still with the institute. And we kind of explore for about 2 to 3 years with typically a PhD student at the helm, and with no guarantee of assurance of placement for them directly, but more it's not so much of a business building exercise, but it's more of what we call an ecosystem building exercise. So we create some common knowledge that the graduate takes to probably build the ecosystem around it. But yeah, there's still a lot more changes that are required.
Thank you, Srinath. I think that really is an important component of the cluster, connecting at the student level to the industry, and I think those are important. I'll move to Srinivas and T-Hub. It's got its own success stories which you would like to share, but I think it's important also to bring out that if within India we would like to see clusters moving in terms of connecting universities, industry, academia, the clinical aspects of it, I think probably Hyderabad qualifies to be a cluster. It may not be called a cluster, but it's a virtual cluster which exists. So what is it that you feel, and an incubation center is central to any cluster that would move. So your experience in saying what works and what does not work if you have to take this forward.
Sure. I'm actually going to take a contrarian view right now, which is I don't believe that all students should be entrepreneurs in the first place. I think that's the wrong path. I think it's wrong of us to suggest it even. Having said that, I think entrepreneurial mindset is something you should definitely teach, right? Which is, how do you turn innovation into a business? How do you look for problems to solve that make an impact, as opposed to, innovation for innovation's sake? This is not a one-size-fits-all, though. Again, it's very, very different between the life sciences versus an e-commerce company, for example. So again, there is no one-size-fits-all. If you look at most founders in Silicon Valley, contrary to popular belief, they're not young. The average age is 41 because they've got experience under their belt. They know what problems they're going to solve. They've got the experience to build a business as opposed to just build a technology that may or may not be used. So that's just about that little piece. Having said that, look, at the end of the day, I think as a cluster, the advantage that you get is one, especially for early stage innovation clusters, which is most people. We're not talking about the Silicon Valleys of the world or the Berlins or even the Londons. The smaller towns like the Hyderabad's or maybe even Sheffield and Liverpool to some extent, not everybody who's an entrepreneur actually knows what that means. They have ideas, they know how to take that idea and kind of validate it a little bit, but they're going to need help to scale that, to turn it into a real business. There's a saying in the startup world, which is that your product is not your product, your business model is your product. And that's something that we really need to teach people, and clusters tend to do that because you're building a culture. If you are surrounded by people who've already been there, done that, you're going to learn automatically. If you're in a cluster where no one's done it before, it's not going to go very far, and that's where the cross-border stuff that you were talking about happens. So if you get people from outside to come in, like our international market access programs, you're getting access to people who've already done this and who are teaching your local guys, and everybody learns from these pieces. So clusters make sense because you can impact multiple people at the same time through multiple programs. I don't think that answered the full question, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. But yes, you did bring out an important point. Of course, I totally agree with you that every student cannot be an entrepreneur. If we start doing that, we wouldn't have any researchers left and we wouldn't have any basic and discovery research happening. But yes, those who do, they need this facilitation and this ecosystem. But the other important point you made about is what the whole purpose of today's panel is, and that's about these cross-border connections that we make and how that can facilitate the ecosystem. I think that's very important and critical, and those are components which, of course, the Hyderabad cluster, Bangalore, these areas have looked at. In fact, from the department, we ourselves have been able to connect some of our incubators through the sister innovation hub that we've had, be it with the US or with EU or UK. We've had many such collaborations where ecosystems have been connected. So I think that's important. And when you talk about a cluster, it need not be physically located in one place. A cluster could be a virtual cluster which can actually connect clusters globally as well. So that's probably a very important component. Dr. Wali, you have tremendous experience of being an innovation foundation located within an academic group, and then looking at a large number of such startups, and also looking at the whole area of technology transfers, etc. Where do you feel we are positioned today within the country, but where do you feel we need to move in terms of these collaborations?
Let me try if I can. Am I audible? Because I'm just taking it off. Okay. A good question. See, the thing is, I've been fortunate enough to be associated with a leading academic institution in the country, which we very early try to put all the elements of an innovation ecosystem in place. Not just the incubator comes much later, but the technology transfer office, the intellectual property policy adoption, then the incubator, and going forward, the research parks. So it's the complete value chain. And first of all, a slight digression. So Srinivas actually spoke my language, so I'll just try to avoid that. Sure. Important thing, what Renu asked is that we've been fortunate that we're a little mature when it came to actually establishing an innovation ecosystem, the startup ecosystem. Just to give you just a flavor of a few examples, IIT Delhi has the maximum number of modern day unicorns that have come up from academia in India, or not just academia, on the very whole. So the kind of role models that we have in the system are such that they are in a position to bring out part of a chain reaction in the entire system. And I agree, all are not entrepreneurial, are not entrepreneurs, but many of them are entrepreneurial. Many of them are actually innovators trying to solve problems which they see around them, are able to attract the right kind of attention, whether by the government, by industry, by the investors. So that's in plenty. But IIT Delhi, or maybe the IITs or an IT system, is not representative of the entire country. The country as a whole is still in its early years of trying to build not just scale, forget about scale, trying to build the ecosystems, the local ecosystems. I would say even when I talk of the cluster approach, that's still further down. But even the basic elements of the innovation ecosystem, at whether the college level or even the tehsil level, the district level, it's extremely missing. Now, what is it that would actually help it? One is the culture, the cultural mindset, which is a big barrier at times. But more important than that is the resource persons, the capacity, whether the people have the requisite capacity, the leadership skills to actually drive creating those small hubs of innovation or the clusters in place or not. Let's forget for the moment the industrial clusters which are there, because the cluster approach actually brings in a lot of competitiveness, tries to aggregate the competencies, the expertise all across. But when it comes to purely innovation and the startups, I'm afraid we are way beyond being a mature nation when it comes to having clusters of innovation in the country. Forget about IITs, which are way ahead of the rest, but I think that is where they can actually look up to the more advanced institutions or universities to build scale at their respective ends.
Thank you, Dr. Wali. Yes, I think you're right in saying that we still have a long journey ahead of us if we have to create or set up these clusters of innovation. But probably learning from experience, learning from different countries, it's important to see how we could learn those best practices and bring in. Of course, it was very rightly said, no one size fits all. So each group that looks at it, each country that looks at it, has to look at its own requirements and see how we bring that forward. I'll just in a minute share the experience that we've had within the whole ecosystem that we have tried to build from DBT and BIRAC. And that's been a long journey for us over the last 5 to 6 years when we've tried to bring in the whole biotech and life sciences space, which is again a high risk area. We've succeeded in trying to bring in a lot of startups into it, over 1,000 startups who are in this whole journey. But we have found these missing gaps as we've taken them through this value chain, be it the critical component of funding. And very correctly said, I think the government needs to really bring in its initial fund more than anything else, not only just to sustain the startups, but to do that risk mitigation. Because the moment the government comes in with the funding, it's easier for us to then even talk to other funders and say, can you come forward and do that funding? So that became a critical component which we did. Many a times this government grant can be used as a way in which you can connect the academy and the industry. And we do that by then making our grant proposals such that we'll only fund when you come together as a group. So that becomes an incentive for groups to come together and take that funding. So that's one model in which once you bring them together, they find the value in each other and they move forward. The other third component that we've done is that how do we then connect them, as I said, to the mentoring activities, and that's where this whole incubation ecosystem does so beautifully. And we have over 30 incubation centers, in fact 35 now, I think, spread across the country, which play a very, very important and critical role. And I think they play an important role not only just in incubating the startups, but in helping incubate their technologies, because it's those technologies then need a lot of refinement as they move on. So we created that particular component of that ecosystem. And then obviously as they move out, they graduate out, the financing, the investments, bringing the investors. From the government of India, we took that step of saying, okay, fine, we also do a risk mitigation and becoming small-time VCs into it. And we said, okay, we'll start an early angel fund. We'll put our small amount of money forward. Maybe that can attract funds. That's helped. That's been able to bring people. But I think what a cluster can do is now to connect all these dots together, bring all of them together at one place. We've been talking about it. We do have an example of 4 clusters, the Bangalore cluster, Faridabad cluster, Pune and Kalyani. But these are again, as I said, institute and startup based, just connecting that. We are now trying to revisit that, and we hope we'll have the 2 missing components, the university on one side and the large industry on the other. And the most important crucial component is the international connections. We hope that through these international connections, we should be able to see vibrant ecosystems, and we have a number of them within the country. We're actually hoping to put out cluster grants and said that only those clusters which come in with each of these components will have access to our grants. So as I said, we do use the grants as a carrot and say, why can you actually take it forward? But those are only incentives. So I think this whole ecosystem within the country is moving, but as Dr. Valli said, we are still way behind what our needs are. Collaboration such as this would be very useful. It will help us to create common clusters which can then have an exchange of information, exchange of best practices. Considering that we have a couple of minutes left, I think it will be a good idea to go to each panelist and just, if you will have your comments on, if you have a wish list and you would love to see what an ideal cluster should look like, which can help solve the problem, what would you want it to be? And maybe that's a common question for each of the panelists to put it forward.
So I'll pick up on that and address some of the points that have come up in conversation. So I think the first point I would make, and prior to taking up this role, I was the UK Consul General in San Francisco, so headed up the UK government's operations in Silicon Valley for 5 years, and spent a lot of time with institutions like Stanford who really support that concept of sort of being an entrepreneur alongside doing your academia as a core part of your work. I think that there are some really practical things that institutions can do to incentivize that type of commercialization work where appropriate. Completely agree with you in terms of it's not appropriate for everyone. It's things like actually, just even allocating time, the visibility of role models. I think we were talking about that earlier, and having the unicorns coming back in to inspire the next generation of students. And then even very practical things like how do you treat the IP? What happens with the IP that comes out of ideas that are spinning out of universities? It's really, really important. The second point I'd make is really around the virtual versus in person. I think virtual is very, very important, particularly when you're talking about distances like that between India and the UK. Actually, the virtual ecosystems we can create are really important. I think, though, that you can't underestimate the importance of people-to-people contact as well. And I think opportunities like this to bring together the people representing the tech sector and the innovation ecosystem on both sides is really vital. The last comment I would make, and this is really sort of a takeaway, I suppose, from having to represent the different sort of technologies coming out of different parts of the UK in my last job as Consul General, is that I think clusters can do well to think about what are their differentiations. So what is their focus? When clusters stand up and say, we do everything, it's actually very hard to really sell the strength that you have there. And, Matt talked about it in the context of, Liverpool really developing its sort of games cluster. And I think that sort of focus and ability to actually say, we're X cluster and we're brilliant at this one thing or these two amazing, really important future technologies can really make the difference between a cluster's success and a cluster's failure.
Thank you. Yes, I think when you're developing clusters and looking at them, I think you need to give it time. Things take time to evolve. We're talking about relationships. Could take years to form a cluster and help it grow. We've got a really good relationship with a city in Alabama, Birmingham, and that's taken some years to come to fruition, but it's been a very successful relationship. Also related to that is research. Is put your research in and make sure that when you're working in clusters and working with other clusters that you're really looking to get the right match. We've done a lot of work with Boston, and that's an obvious city in the US. Yeah, it's got a very thriving ecosystem, and it's a really obvious one to make a relationship with. But there's other places as well, and I'm sure in the US they're looking at the UK and they know about Oxford and Cambridge, London, but maybe not necessarily Liverpool. Putting that research in to look at what cities are a good match is a really important thing. I spent a couple of days in Bangalore, which has been excellent. It's first time in India for me, and I really see things in Bangalore that I think would be good matches for Liverpool. They say, it's the startup capital, and I think it's a city that would be very interested in looking at. And so don't force things though. Don't just demand things and say, look, you should talk to him and she should talk to her, and things can happen that way. You can't manage everything, and I think letting freedom happen and letting companies work things out for themselves is really important.
So coming from the academic perspective again, I think one design principle should be that a university or an institution of higher education should be an integral part of any technology cluster by design right from day one. And physical proximity is really important, even though we are in the digital age and so on. And secondly, I think for most of the technology curriculum that we have today, right, students are not taught what it really takes, for example, to write a proposal or work through something and so on. Right? And, so I would say make proposal writing an integral element of higher education curriculum. Right? So let them actually take up a problem that's posed by the industry or by the government and for social good and so on, write a proposal and work through it for several years, and then even if it fails, doesn't matter, show some outcome in some form, and that I think really builds the entrepreneurial mindset. If they need not become entrepreneurs, but really the entrepreneurial mindset, or more fundamentally the problem solving mindset, that is what is really required.
So I think a couple of things, right? One is when you're building out a cluster, you need an entity that takes on that responsibility. It may or may not be the government. It can be. It doesn't have to be. Like in our case, we're independent, but we work with the government. But it needs to be run by not an academic, not a politician, not a bureaucrat, but by an entrepreneur. If you're not an entrepreneur running this, you're probably not going to understand the problems that startups face. And I think that's critical, that people are at the center of all of this. The other thing is that startups are at the heart of everything. We tend to, in our organizations, think that what we do is the most important thing. We're not the most important thing. Those startups out there are the most important thing, and we're all enablers, right? And you should not lose focus on that part. As a cluster representative or head or whatever, you also have to look at two different things. Typically what I see nowadays is that a lot of governments are looking at this, and they're looking at the capacity building side of things, which means they're making sure that every entrepreneur that wants to be an entrepreneur gets the support that they want, but they're not focusing on success. You have the private institutions that say, I don't really care about the cluster per se, I care about my cohort, my investment profile, how do I make them successful? As a cluster, you're not going to succeed unless both sides of those are met. You have the pipeline with capacity building, and you have the success stories that you're helping to enable. And the other one is what Priya also mentioned, which is, as a cluster, what makes you different from everyone else? You cannot become Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley for a reason. What are your unique strengths as a city or as a state? What industry already thrives over there? And where's your government heading, and become a part of that regional growth story? If you focus, I think that's what happens, and we're seeing a lot of that happening now.
The disadvantage of speaking last is much of your views have already been spoken about. But nonetheless, what I would want to articulate is that cluster should actually embody all the stakeholders, the government, the university, the industry, the regulators, all about that. An ideal situation though, and there should be strong policy enablers and champions and capacity to drive it. So that is, in short, I would want that what a cluster should be. And university, of course, has to play a great role because they are the ideas factory.
Thank you very much. I think we're very well on time, but this has been an interesting panel because we have been able to get information on what the views of or our panelists are as to what really a cluster should look like. It's also important to see that this is like any entrepreneurial journey. You will never have all the answers to all the questions because you'll have new challenges which come in tomorrow. It's going to be a dynamically moving process. We'll never have a perfect cluster model that will be before us. The moment we feel that we've got a perfect cluster, we'll have new challenges which come up again. So this journey has to move on. But I think it's important, and the messages which have come out from this panel are very, very clear. We do need to have all the key ingredients together. Physically, for sure, connecting them virtually as we move on for bringing in best practices. The academia, the industry, the startup, the government, the investors, and all those who matter to take this forward. So I think it's important. So probably when we began by saying we need to look at, a couple of years back, start funding and supporting entrepreneurs. We then moved into incubation centers. I think we've all agreed that cluster is the way forward if we have to take it ahead. And we hope that with this conversation that we've had, we've reinforced and re-strengthened our point, saying that we do need to have international partnerships as we build on. And India, for sure, I can say that from the government, we have been having wonderful partnerships. We'll be more than happy to see how we could connect these. So that's the next panel, I think, is it? So we've been asked to put our mics off. So, well, that's it. Thank you so much.